approach, in particular those raised by Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, along with the regional Inuit associations, about restrictions being proposed on Inuit-owned lands, as well as requirements for Inuit impact and benefit agreements to be negotiated for some of these locations. On the right-hand side of this slide, we can see Class 2 migratory bird habitat sites shown in an orange color, a large area near Iqaluit out in Frobisher Bay leading into Baffin Bay has been identified, largely marine area where setbacks would apply from key features. So again, this is a conditional use area with no outright prohibitions, but a number of setback requirements. And in addition, we can see an example of a Class 3 migratory bird habitat site, which is identified as a valued component. So in this case, near the community of Pengnatung in Cumberland Sound, there's a large yellow-colored area on the south and western shores of Cumberland Sound that is identified as being important for migratory birds, but does not include detailed setback requirements or any prohibited uses, but is included as a valued component for consideration by project proponents and other regulatory authorities. The next subsection of Chapter 2 deals with the very important issue of caribou. Throughout the planning process, this has been a key part of the discussions, and there are several different types of caribou habitat identified in the 2021 draft plan. On slide 24, we can see both caribou calving and post-calving areas identified as limited use designations with the year-round prohibition on several types of land uses, similar to what I mentioned previously for the migratory birds. They would come with restrictions on mineral exploration and production, oil and gas, all-weather roads, quarries, and again, large-scale turbines, wind turbines, as well as hydroelectric power generation. For these types of caribou habitat, it's important to note that the government of Nunavut provided very detailed analysis of caribou habitat throughout their seasonal ranges throughout the year, but on Baffin Island and within the islands of Nunavut generally, the government of Nunavut did not have sufficient caribou collaring information to conduct the statistical analysis they relied on for the mainland caribou herds. So the government of Nunavut has been the primary provider of much of the Commission's information on caribou, but here in the South Baffin, you can see some large yellow shaded areas on these maps, and they were identified by the Kikataluk Wildlife Board, who worked directly with the Hunters and Trappers organizations for all communities in the region. And this submission was in response to the 2016 draft plan. So these are new additional areas that have been included in this draft plan for the first time, and is a good demonstration of the Commission giving equal weight to both the scientific information provided by the Government of Nunavut for the mainland, along with the traditional knowledge or Inuit Kaimayutikangit on Baffin Island, and giving a great weight to both of those types of information. As with many issues in the draft plan, the subject of caribou and caribou habitat has been extensive, and there have been a variety of different perspectives on how the land use plan should manage these areas. We've noted that some participants support the proposed approach in the draft land use plan of providing limited use designations with year-round prohibitions. Some other participants have recommended that a seasonal restriction would be more appropriate for caribou calving, post-calving areas. Again, there have been concerns expressed about year-round restrictions on Inuit-owned lands and the need for an alternative approach to be taken on them. In addition, I would note that for the information provided by the Government of Nunavut on, again, the mainland caribou herds, there were very detailed dates for when caribou were relying on these different types of habitat, and that has been incorporated into the land use plan as well. But for the information provided by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board, who worked with, of course, the Hunters and Trappers organizations, those detailed dates were not provided and were not available to the Commission when preparing this draft plan. So there's a bit of a gap in the land use plan right now, where the Commission is proposing both year-round prohibitions on caribou calving grounds, as well as seasonal restrictions on other types of land use that may be appropriate in the area and would conform, but the Commission does not currently have for caribou calving and post-calving within the herds on Baffin Island, for example. Slide 25 identifies caribou key access corridors, which are important parts of caribou migration that were identified by the Government of Nunavut, again based on collaring data. You note that none of those areas have been identified within the Iqaluit region. And in addition, the Commission has identified many caribou freshwater crossings that are used by caribou during their migration. But again, none of these locations have been identified within the Iqaluit region. But both of those are also included as limited use areas in the draft plan. On slide 26, we have caribou sea ice crossings shown on the left-hand side of the slide. There are a few identified near Iqaluit and Senarayak, for example. These areas are included in the draft plan as conditional use areas with seasonal restrictions on shipping during the frozen water seasons in order to allow caribou to continue to cross the sea ice during their migration. On the right-hand side, we also have shown important peri-caribou areas. Of course, this is relevant to the communities of Resolute Bay and Grise Fjord, so I'll just quickly note here today that they are also included as limited use areas in the draft plan. We also have, on slide 27, caribou winter ranges. In some instances on the mainland, for example, they are included as valued components, as those habitats were considered to be of less importance than some other types of habitats on the mainland. But on the islands, caribou winter habitat was identified as often being very important, and some of these areas are included as limited use designations as well. On the right-hand side of the slide, we also have caribou migration corridors. These areas are identified as valued components. Again, those being identified for participants gathered here today, just in the communities, again, of Iqaluit and Sanarayak. And the final slide on caribou identifies caribou summer and late summer areas, as well as caribou rutting areas on the right-hand side. And again, this information was provided by the government of Nunavut, but was not available for the Iqaluit region. But they are identified as valued components, generally. Slide 29 identifies, on the left-hand side, polar bear denning areas. These areas have been identified by a number of different sources, including Commission's direct consultations with community members. Again, information provided by the board who worked with the Hunters and Trappers organization of the region, as well as information provided by the government of Nunavut and World Wildlife Fund. This is an example of a fairly unique plan requirement where polar bear denning areas are assigned a conditional use designation with seasonal requirements. So in this case, during polar bear denning season, project proponents that are proposing to conduct earth-moving activities or something that would disturb the snow that the bears are denning in, such as drilling or blasting or the use of heavy equipment, would first need to have a polar bear monitor conduct a survey of the area they're looking to conduct those activities in. And if the polar bear monitor identifies any dens or suspected active polar bear dens, they would then need to implement a 1 kilometer setback from the area that was identified until the polar bear monitor confirms that the bears have left the dens and the general area. So rather than a specific hard stop on activities seasonally, this would only apply to some activities that would have the potential to disturb or damage the dens, and there's a requirement for a procedure to take place, in this case a survey conducted by a polar bear monitor. The feedback to this approach has generally been positive, and most participants have expressed support for this approach. But as with all issues, the Commission remains very much open to feedback on whether this is an appropriate approach or if it can be improved. The right-hand side of slide 29 shows identified walrus haulouts. So these, of course, are areas along the shore where walrus haul themselves out of the water during open water months. And as I mentioned earlier in a previous example, many participants identified the high degree of sensitivity to walrus when they're gathered together at these locations. Information again was collected from a variety of sources, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Iqaluit Wildlife Board, NPC's direct community engagements, as well as a very detailed study provided by World Wildlife Fund Canada. For these areas, the draft plan proposes a limited use designation with year-round restrictions on a number of land use activities, but also very detailed setback requirements for other activities. So depending on the size of ships or boats approaching the walrus haul-out sites, there are different minimum distances that the vessels would need to stay away from these locations. That would apply to things like film crews or tourism activities, but again, importantly, not to community vessels. There are also different setbacks for land-based activities, as well as different types of aircraft that would be flying over these important locations. This is another example of an area where feedback on the draft plan has generally been positive, and we look forward to hearing any further thoughts from participants during this hearing on the management of these areas. Slide 30 identifies beluga and narwhal calving areas. A lot of this information is newly included in the 2021 draft plan. And it's important to note that a different approach was taken for each of these types of whale calving habitat, depending on the location and extent of the identified calving areas. Now, this will also apply to bowhead calving areas, which are on the next slide. So in some instances, for example, in Clearwater Fjord near the community of Pangnirtung, the beluga calving area, limited use area with restrictions on activities and vessels from entering these areas during calving season. Of course, Clearwater Fjord is a relatively small fjord or inlet separated from major shipping routes within the territory, and the impact of restricting shipping in these areas was considered by the Commission to be acceptable. However, as you can see, some of the larger areas identified on these maps overlap significantly with the areas used within Nunavut for shipping. So this is an example of the Commission relying on the potential for non-renewable resources, transportation, and linear infrastructure to directly influence the recommended approach for the management of these areas. So where the identified areas are larger and include significant overlap with shipping areas, the Commission has recommended a valued component identification for these areas rather than limited use. And again, this same approach was taken for beluga, narwhal, and the bowhead calving areas shown on slide 31. The right-hand side of slide 31 shows some small Atlantic cod lakes. Sorry, can we switch the slide too? Thanks. These are a handful of unique locations where populations of Atlantic cod have evolved within coastal or tidal lakes. So within these very small locations, there are unique populations of Arctic cod that live in these lakes that are, I guess, of some interest and importance due to their uniqueness. Throughout the planning process, the Commission has been made aware of these areas, but there was very little support for including specific land use designations for these small lakes. And as a result, the Commission has chosen in this version of the draft plan to identify them as valued components without specific management requirements beyond that. Slide 32 shows a few different types of marine areas that have generally been identified. So on the left-hand side, we see what are called ecologically and biologically significant areas. That, of course, is a bit of a mouthful, but it basically refers to important marine areas that have been identified by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for their importance to a variety of species. These areas were identified in the land use planning process, but did not come with specific recommendations on how the areas should be managed through the Nunavut land use plans specifically. So the Commission has chosen to include these areas in the draft plan as valued components for consideration. On the right-hand side of the slide, we also see polynyas, or areas that are frequently open water during the winter months. They can be very important habitat and feeding areas for a variety of wildlife. And in the 2021 draft plan, the Commission has recommended that they generally be included as valued components. But it's important to note that some polynyas have been treated differently. For example, some of those associated with migratory bird habitat sites. Or on slide 33, we also see on the right-hand side the North Water or Savarayuk polynya near Grise Fjord that's being considered for joint management by the Inuit of Nunavut and Inuit of Greenland. And in this case, the Commission has proposed a conditional use designation to seasonally restrict ship traffic from entering the small portion of the area that overlaps with the Nunavut settlement area. This is an example of a transboundary consideration, or an area that goes across borders. And I just want to note that the areas of equal use and occupancy, as they're known, between the Inuit of Nunavut and Nunavik, that we'll be talking a great deal about this week, are not included in this section in Chapter 2. They could be, but the Commission has chosen to include that particular area of overlap in Chapter 4 on building healthier communities. So we'll be reviewing those areas this afternoon. The final note in Chapter 2, and we don't have a slide for it, but the topic is addressed in Chapter 2 on climate change. The Commission is aware of different concerns arising due to a changing climate and the accelerated effects here in the Arctic. And while there are no specific land use designations or plan requirements at this time associated with climate change, we do want to note that it was a consideration in the Commission's assessment of all of the different areas and issues included in the draft plan. And we point to some examples, including the effects of climate change on caribou that are making them more vulnerable, including things like increased icing events, making it more difficult for caribou to access their forage through the snow and now thicker layers of ice during the winter, as well as increased insect harassment in the summer months due to a warming climate, and also the effects of increased numbers of forest fires, of course, in the southern portions of the range in other regions. In addition, the Commission considered the effects of climate change on polar bear, for example, due to declining periods of stable sea ice from seals. So again, although there are no specific designations or plan requirements, the impacts of climate change on species within Nunavut was a consideration in the Commission's decisions to include management approaches in the draft plan for these species. That concludes our overview of Chapter 2, and the next chapter, I believe, we'll get to this afternoon. I'll stop and turn back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We are heading towards lunchtime. We can take a break, start again at 1:15.
1:15.
Back here at 1:15. If you want to go for lunch, bring your name tag and you can go in the Legion. Same thing this evening. If you want to go for supper at the Legion, just bring your pass. You can have access. That's good. We'll see you this afternoon.